Hey, John.
Hey, George, how you doing?
Oh, pretty good. How are you?
I'm all right. You know, summer is it's winding down. August, and I start teaching again in a few weeks, but still got some summer to savor.
Oh, well, that's good. God, when I woke up this morning, it was 68 degrees.
Wow,
Fahrenheit.
Have you been
nice and cool?
Have you been getting? Does Santa Fe get these terrible heat waves that some of the rest of the country has gotten this summer?
We had some hot days, but I'm not sure. I don't think it ever got to 100 here. Mm-hmm. I think maybe the high 90s. So, that's a little hot, but for a very brief period. But mostly the problem has been, we're just having a horrible drought this year.
Yeah.
Like normally in early July, the rains, the summer monsoons, as they call them, will start. This weather pattern that comes off the Gulf of Mexico. And this year we got all the way to early August before they really began, which it hasn't happened in the 18 years I've lived here. And then and now that it started, we've been getting some nice, afternoon, evening showers, but they've been much, much sparser than usual. So, I think I read somewhere that it's been the driest winter, spring, and it looks like now very likely the driest summer in recorded history for this particular sub-region.
I'm not sure we were going to talk about this, but just have there been an unusual number of human-bear encounters in New Mexico recently?
There haven't, but I read that piece you wrote in Scientific American about your encounter with a bear. And usually when it gets this dry, we do get bears coming down from the mountains into the areas around the edge of town, mm-hmm. Raiding garbage cans and stealing picnic baskets.
Yeah, I had read, I think it was in the New York Times, that there had been an upsurge out west, and it's been a problem here in the Northeast for a while too. In New Jersey, New York, places like that, it was so bad in New Jersey that I think it was last fall that they started a bear hunt for just a very short period of time. But all these hunters went out and shot as many bears as they could because bears were starting to come into the suburbs and knock over garbage cans and bird feeders and that sort of thing, and scaring the hell out of some people. And,
but if that's the worst they were doing, it seems a little extreme to go out and shoot them.
Yeah, because lethal bear encounters are really rare, and the reason I bring this up is because, as you know, I literally almost. I was running. I didn't actually hit the bear, but I almost did. I was running up this path on a mountain near me, and I was, sort of in a fog. All of a sudden, I see this gigantic black thing blocking my path, and it was a bear. I say gigantic. My guess is that it was a young female, maybe 200 pounds or so, mm-hmm. and it turned out to be a lot more scared of me than I was of it. And it turned around and hightailed it and ran into the woods, which is a good thing, which means that it's still afraid of people, which it should be.
Wow. So, I forget when you see a bear like that, there's one of two things you should do. You're either supposed to freeze and slowly back off, or you're supposed to wave your hands and slowly approach and act aggressive. And it would be good to know, which was correct.
Well, I think it depends on the bear, but what I did was I stared at it, and I was trying to decide what to do, and I ended up throwing my arms in the air going, "Hey!" And it was funny. It was almost comical. Its eyes kind of bugged out of its head, and it went, "Yikes!" Turned around and ran into the woods.
Wow.
I have since, one of the responders to my blog post said, that was a really stupid thing to do, John. And, what if the bear had been aggressive? It would have totally kicked your ass. But
I'm kind of thinking that with bears, this is probably a black bear, right?
Yes, black bear.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking you're supposed to freeze and just kind of let the bear, realize that you're not doing anything and lose interest. But I urge people to look that up, since we don't know and could be giving false information.
Right.
Now, there was a really funny Saturday Night Live skit years and years ago, the old Saturday Night Live, where they're out in the woods, and then one by one they see all these scary animals, like a black bear, a grizzly, a mountain lion, coyotes, and then one of them pulls a wallet card out that tells what you're supposed to do for each one of these these creatures. Whether you're supposed to, wave, flap your arms up and down wildly, or get down on the ground and crouch. And
Right.
it seems like it's different. Mountain lion is different from a bear, as I recall. And
well, I was doing an internet search on bad bear meetings, and I encountered this one horrible story about a woman who I think was trained. She might have been a forest ranger or something. I think this was out west, but it was a black bear, and it attacked her, and she went into the fetal position, and it started literally eating one of her arms, and it was eating that arm, and with the other arm, she pulled out her cell phone and called for help. By the time the help had arrived, the bear had eaten that arm as well. So it ate, while she was lying in the fetal position, it ate both her arms. She survived, but obviously I would say that was not a good strategy for dealing with that bear.
Yeah, at least not with that bear.
Yeah.
God, I've never heard of that happening with the black bear encounter. I mean, of course, grizzlies.
Yeah.
Forget it.
Yeah, there was right after I saw this bear, there was a bad incident, I think, in Alaska, where a grizzly mauled a bunch of kids for camping. But listen, George, I actually have a really serious issue I wanted to talk about today.
Oh, okay.
I know, I sent you some material that I'd done on antidepressants. Recently, I did a kind of a blog post and a half on it, responding to a big piece in the New York Review of Books. Since I wrote my piece and read that article in the New York Review of Books, I read a book that I think is one of the most important books published in quite a while. This book had more of an impact on me than any book I've read in years. It's called Anatomy of an Epidemic. It's by a journalist named Robert Whitaker, former reporter for the Boston Globe. He's written at least one other book about mental health treatments in the United States. And this book is, first of all, it's very well written, exhaustively researched, written in about as dispassionate a tone as you can expect from a book that is uncovering what looked to be horrendous abuses by American psychiatry. And so, I thought we were going to be talking about antidepressants specifically. Mm-hmm. What Whitaker does is look at all the treatments for mental illnesses, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and bipolar, and he first looks at adults and then looks at children, and his conclusion is that the drugs that are being used now to treat mental illness are actually, over the long term, they can help in the short term, help some people in the short term, but over the long term, they make people sicker than they would have been if they had never taken medications. They make many people sicker.
And so this goes a lot farther than what many critics, at least of the the serotonin reuptake, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, have said. The SSRIs, the antidepressants that they basically just don't do anything and they're no better than placebos. But he's saying that these and other psychiatric drugs, like antipsychotic drugs, actually are harmful.
That's right.
Cause brain damage.
He sort of starts where, so in my second book, The Undiscovered Mind, I looked in detail at psychiatric treatments, both drugs and psychotherapies, and my conclusion was that they are scarcely, if at all, better than placebos. So there's a whole literature on that. And, the way I describe...
We'll get into that.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to it, and if you're just going to rely on epidemiological studies, that's really, I don't think it's really very persuasive one way or the other, whether the epidemiological studies showed that they worked or that they didn't work, for a lot of interesting reasons that have to do with deciding who your sample pool is going to be, and evaluating who's really depressed and who's not depressed, and different levels of depression or kinds of depression.
Absolutely. This science is extremely hard, because even defining something like depression is very difficult, and it's necessarily somewhat subjective. Defining improvement in somebody who is depressed or bipolar or schizophrenic, that also can be extremely difficult, and there's a lot of variation cross-culturally, even from hospital to hospital or doctor to doctor. But Whitaker goes way beyond the thesis of saying that these drugs just aren't very effective. And by the way, I know that these drugs can help some people short-term and some people even long-term. But I think Whitaker has amassed a really persuasive amount of evidence that these drugs hurt people over the long term. And we're talking about the antipsychotic.
Sounds like a very important book.
Yeah. And here's another thing, George, that I think that is really worrisome. I mean, I really came away from this book. I just finished it late last night. Very, very disturbed. One of the things that disturbs me most is that this was ignored by mainstream media. The New York Times didn't review it. The Washington Post didn't review it. There's a little tiny piece in Time magazine on it. The media have really stayed away from this book, I think in part because Whitaker has a section at the end where he talks about how the psychiatry establishment in this country, with the help of the pharmaceutical companies and even mental health advocacy organizations, have really sold psychiatric drugs to the American public, often with the help of the media. That the media have kind of bought this idea that mental illnesses stem from these very specific chemical imbalances in the brain, for example, deficits of serotonin in the case of depression. And Whitaker is saying, he just shows really that there's virtually no evidence for this, no evidence for these imbalance theories.
There's virtually no evidence that SSRIs or the other antidepressants are effective. I'm first talking about the chemical imbalance theory, and then effectiveness is sort of another issue. But okay, go ahead. Oh, well, yeah, we'll get into that. But one thing, when you're talking about the media, I mean, I don't know why the book wasn't reviewed. It's surprising because, on one hand, now most of the articles, or many of the articles that you're seeing in the general press are really doing kind of not going along, but reporting the backlash. All these new studies that show that seem to show that SSRIs are no more effective than placebos, except in severely depressed patients. So we can't really say that the press has been promoting this. I mean, they were basically reporting on what was an enthusiasm among the psychiatric and psychological community at the time.
That's
and
true.
What the studies were saying, at least the ones that came out, and now they're really reporting on the backlash. So that doesn't seem like a credible reason why the book wouldn't be reviewed. Because I know at the New York Times book review they don't sit around and, like, if an editor finds something critical of the press or even the New York Times specifically, that they're not going to review the book. If anything, the controversy might attract them to the book. But there must be some reason if it's, it sounds like a really great book, that it didn't get enough attention.
I know. I hate to listen. I'm really reluctant to appeal to media conspiracy theories as well. But this book, I think, is so important in drawing together a mass of material that has been reported by, for example, the New York Times, at least piecemeal. The New York Times has been all over, for example, conflicts of interest in psychiatry and medicine in general when it comes to taking money from pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers. They have definitely reported on these studies that are now coming out on the weaknesses of certain psychiatric treatments, medications, antidepressants, and others. But Whitaker puts it all together in a way that makes it, he really, I think, is uncovering the equivalent of a gigantic scientific crime, a really large-scale abuse of these very powerful people, modern psychiatrists, especially under the aegis of the American Psychiatric Association, which for political and financial reasons, according to Whitaker, have promoted this way of dealing with mental illness that, at least circumstantially, has been profoundly damaging to millions of people.
Well, I mean, that's a very controversial, well, that's a whole pile of controversial theses. One, that it's been damaging. Because, I mean, what I gather from that review in the New York Review of Books, which is great, by the way, it reviews 3 different books along with the, I guess, most recent edition of the psychiatric, diagnostic manual.
Right.
And it's written by, what was she, the former editor of, was it the New England Journal of Medicine or the Journal of American Medicine?
Marcia Angell, who's now at Harvard.
Yeah, it's a really good, but I get the impression, even from reading that this Whitaker is really kind of a lone voice in the woods, and then the second controversial thing is, like, if he's actually saying that all of these psychiatrists, including people at the top of their profession, are cynically doing this because they're getting big, large experiments and laboratories funded by these pharmaceutical companies, or if they're doing it because they genuinely believe in their own experience working with patients every day that these things are helpful.
I think it's probably a combination. I just don't want to believe that that psychiatrists are knowingly giving people things that will harm them. And the paradox is that many of these treatments, for example, the so-called neuroleptics, these are the drugs. Thorazine was the first. There have been many since then that are used to treat psychosis, especially schizophrenia. It's been known for quite a while that they have side effects, but the doctors say, well, you just weigh the pros and cons, and you've got somebody who's floridly psychotic. You've got to quell those symptoms right now. It has to do with short-term benefits versus long-term outcomes, and there are surprisingly few studies of long-term outcomes for any of these diseases. There also now, it's really hard to find people who are unmedicated to compare to people who've been on medications.
Okay, but let's talk a minute about Thorazine and the antipsychotics, because I mean, the big story was at the 60s or the 70s when they started using these, starting out, as a dribble and then a flood in state psychiatric hospitals, and the result has been vastly fewer people hospitalized in state mental hospitals under what were often horrible conditions, and people, just so completely psychotic that they could not be in the world, and getting them out the door, and unfortunately in many cases onto the streets. And that was at least one thesis about what at least the appearance of a rise in homelessness and people, vagabonds wandering from city to city that weren't really able to hold down jobs and support themselves. So there's a trade-off there, but if you ever seen somebody who's like truly either so psychotic or so depressed that they can just not do anything except, lie in bed and just basically soil themselves with their own feces and urine unless they're constantly being attended to. If, giving someone like this some kind of drug that might have harmful side effects, it seems like that's a pretty reasonable trade-off.
Absolutely, George. And Whitaker goes into that history in detail. It really started in the 50s. The deinstitutionalization of a lot of people in mental hospitals. It had to do as much with changes in the way that states were compensated for people who had mental disabilities as it
really?
did. According to Whitaker.
Huh.
But here, let me just give you a couple of facts, and then
That's
I want
interesting.
And then I want to mention a couple of caveats that I have about Whitaker's
Okay, and I'd
book.
like to talk more, to get beyond these epidemiological studies, because I read this really rather amazing paper that just flies in the face of a lot of this. That was in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2008 called Major Depressive Order by Bellmaker and Agam, and it really gives you a very different impression than what you would get from reading this New York Review of Books article and some of the recent articles about the epidemiological studies that seem to show that SSRIs are no better than placebos.
George, I would not say now that I think sort of statistically SSRIs, according to lots of studies, are no better than placebos, but I know they help some people. I have friends who swear to me, and I can't second guess them, that their lives have been saved by by
which
drugs
could be a
of various
placebo
kinds.
effect.
Pardon me?
Yeah, that doesn't mean it's not a placebo effect, because we've talked about this before. Like I had my own experience taking an SSRI called sertraline, which was originally marketed, and there's definitely much to be critical of about the marketing of this stuff. Zoloft, it's supposed to loft up your spirits, and I had a experience with that. This was about 10 years ago, and I really thought it worked, and I took it for years, and then stopped taking it, and I didn't really notice that I was feeling particularly different. But looking back on that, I'm not at all convinced that it wasn't a placebo effect. So
it's interesting. Whitaker actually, he says that he's talking to some doctors who are terrified of long-term consequences of these drugs, but say they can be helpful in the short term, and for some patients they should definitely be used to try to sort of calm them down and take care of.
Okay, so he does say that.
Yes, he definitely does. He is not a no-drug type person, but the big mystery that he is trying to solve, it can really be summed up very easily. It's basically that over the past 20 or 30 years, the number of people who are defined legally as severely mentally disabled, who actually get benefits from the federal government or from state governments, has tripled. That number is tripled.
The reported number is tripled.
The reported number is tripled. Now, of course, there's all sorts of problems that you could have with qualifications that you would have to have with those sorts of statistics. But still, that's a pretty robust increase. It's tripled. At the same time, the number of prescriptions for antidepressants and antipsychotic drugs over the same period has gone up 50-fold.
Well, yeah, but you could say that for any pharmaceutical that was invented that was found to be effective. More and more doctors would prescribe it, where there used to be nothing to prescribe for some particular condition, whether it's mental or physical. And again, on this tripling of the number of cases, as people hear about people who are benefiting, or whether from the placebo effect or not, from one of these antidepressants or one of these other psychiatric drugs, they're more likely to seek out treatment. And in a generally more affluent society with better means of communication, more and more people are going to hear about this. And there's less stigma now to mental illness, so more people are likely to go to a doctor and say, hey, I think I'm, maybe clinically depressed. So I don't know.
That's all true. That's all true. But this one figure, it's not the tripling figure, is people who are so disabled that they can't hold a job, they can't really take care of themselves, so they're getting money from the federal government. And I think it's certainly interesting, at the very least, that figure should have gone up so much at the same time when these supposedly beneficial drugs are flooding the population. Now
that's going to be hard to teach. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, actually, but everything that you said is definitely valid, and people should keep that in mind when they're reading Whitaker's book. I'm not saying that Whitaker is absolutely right in the conclusions that he draws, but I haven't seen anything that I consider a refutation of his interpretation. He's definitely been shouted down by a lot of psychiatrists, not in a reasonable way. The biggest problem I have with his analysis is he cites some very interesting studies of, for example, how schizophrenics who are treated with medications or treated very lightly differ long-term from those who have the standard treatment, who start getting neuroleptics right away and then throughout their lives. And he says that basically the less medication people take, the better they do long-term. Now, the obvious response to that could be, well, the people who aren't taking as much medication aren't as sick in the first place.
Yeah.
It could be that problem with sort of cause and effect. All I'm saying is
so hard to tease these things out.
It is.
And especially from surveys and epidemiological studies. That reminds me, I ask you, I've been reading about this subject for other reasons recently, and, I keep running into, you read all these papers evaluating different antidepressants, and they refer to the Hamilton Depression Scale.
Yes.
So they'll say, before and after treatment, their Hamilton Depression Scale number went from something or other. So I Googled this and found that, of course, there's an online Hamilton Depression Scale, and so I emailed you about that. Did you take the test?
I did.
Okay, so did I. And first I want to say that they have a big warning in red print saying you're not supposed to do this in your own home. And when you see the first questions, you can see why. It's because the questions and answers are really written as though it's being filled out as by a psychiatrist or psychologist or counselor who's interviewing you. So under depressed mood, sadness, hopeless, helpless, worthless, the choices are absent. These feelings are indicated only on questioning. These feelings are spontaneously reported verbally. So we both had to kind of imagine that, we were what we would say if we were in a clinical interview kind of situation. So it's going to be distorted. But anyway, what was your score?
Let me see. Mine was 31.
31. And how's that?
No, I'm just kidding. Mine was 9. I don't even know what 31 would mean. I would assume that means
it's high or low. So yours was 9.
Mine was 9.
And what's the evaluation?
That I'm not depressed. My major, basically the things that I said I had problems with were mainly sleep problems.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, my score was 15.
Uh-huh.
And the evaluation was, there are signs of mild depression. Further evaluation may be warranted. Which sounds right, but the thing that really struck me about this test is, if this is honestly the whole test, and I don't know that it is, I just can't believe that they actually use this as, put a significant amount of weight on this in evaluating whether someone's depressed or not. It just seems really, I don't know.
Superficial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Insomnia in middle of night.
Well, listen, some of these things are
or working activities, no difficulty, or thoughts and feelings of incapacity, fatigue, or weakness, loss of interest in activities, but our decreased time actually spent in activities, and these are all related to depression, but there's just a total here of 17 questions.
Yeah, and some of these things obviously are age related. So I think a lot of guys my age that I know have problems, especially waking up in the middle of the night, to take a leak or something, and then not being able to get back to sleep. I have a problem with that quite often, and I know a lot of other guys who do as well. Ideas of guilt or rumination over past errors or sinful deed. I mean, Jesus, who doesn't have that?
Yeah. Or this example, suicide. not a funny subject, but the choices are suicide, absent, feels life is not worth living, wishes he were dead, or any thoughts of possible death to self, suicide ideas or gesture, and then attempts at suicide.
Yeah.
So I don't know, reading that again, that seems to really kind of nail down the different levels where someone could just feel like they'd get on an airplane and in the past they would maybe have the momentary thought like, oh God, what if the plane crashes, and then forget about it, and it might be like their response to their own feeling might be, well, I don't care.
Yeah.
It's not like life is so great. So I guess that comes under wishes he were dead or thoughts of any possible death to self. But those are two very different things. You can wish you were dead and then not mind if you should happen to die for random reasons.
Right. I think we've talked about this before. There was one period in my life about 30 years ago when I was really clinically depressed. I wasn't being treated, but looking back, I definitely was. And what was remarkable about it was that it started off feeling psychological and ended up feeling physical, like organic, palpable. And so I'm very sympathetic to the idea that, and also, I've met schizophrenic and bipolar people. I definitely think that there is something very, not to say that there even is a dichotomy between the mental and the physical, but these diseases clearly have a dimension that goes way beyond the psychological.
They have to, unless you're a mind-body dualist and
Right.
believe that the mind is, the whole Cartesian thing, that the mind is separate from the body. Depression and all these things have a biochemical basis, and it's this complex feedback loop where, you can have a molecular imbalance possibly, or some kind of molecular effects that are causing a psychological state, and yet the psychological state may itself feed back through ways we really don't understand into the physical. So
Absolutely.
So there's nothing controversial about that.
But what's interesting about Whitaker, and this is where I would like to see more research, he looks back even to the 19th century, but then the early 20th century, before the Thorazine revolution. And of course there were biotreatments in the early 20th century, lobotomy, electroshock therapy, and so forth, started in the 30s and 40s. But what he says that's really interesting is that in general, depression especially, also anxiety, even like panic attacks and so forth, bipolar, which used to be very, very rare, but to the extent that it was even recognized, it's true of this, and even schizophrenia, to a certain extent, were all seen as very often, for a majority of patients, what's called self-limiting. In other words, you have an episode and it kind of plays itself out. Sometimes it takes a while, especially with schizophrenia. It can take years. But according to Whitaker, if you go back just to the 40s or 30s, a majority of people would eventually be discharged from mental hospitals. Whereas now, once you get a diagnosis of schizophrenia, God, it's just a life sentence. Very few people really become healthy again. You're just managing your disease for the rest of your life. Now, the evidence is pretty tentative that Whitaker cites, but it's very suggestive.
So he's actually saying that in cases like, to go, to a cinematic parody of a mental hospital, like the one in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that, very, very seriously deranged patients in a state hospital on a maximum security ward like that some of them were actually, if not cured, they improved enough that they were discharged and went on to lead, relatively normal lives.
Yes, that's true. Now, of course,
so that he establishes, or are you saying that the evidence that he
presents evidence, whether
Yeah, but you're saying you didn't find it entirely persuasive.
It's not a slam dunk. You only get the really massive statistics, and very, very careful monitoring of people at all stages of disease and large-scale clinical trials and so forth over the last 40, 50 years or so. So when you go back into the first half of the 20th century, it's much more anecdotal, but there are some data available. And what Whitaker also says is that there are some kind of, unfortunately, they tend to be viewed as renegades, but there are people there are psychiatrists who are trying to treat schizophrenics, for example. Schizophrenia obviously is the most severe of all mental illnesses, but there are some programs in Finland and Lapland, for example, and some tentative programs starting here in the States also, in which medication is kind of a last resort, and so it might be used and then withdrawn. A lot of psychotherapy. The received wisdom that I'd always believed, actually, is that schizophrenics cannot be treated with psychotherapy. But some of these programs have turned out to be very successful. There's this one in Finland in particular that not only has a very good record for rehabilitating schizophrenics, helping them go back into the community, get jobs, get married, but is cheaper.
Yeah.
It's cheaper because the people go back, because they get better, as opposed to being wards of the state forever.
No, it seems like a very enlightened approach if it's working. But, I definitely want to read this book because, it just sounds very important, and I'm so surprised as you from your description that it didn't cause a bigger splash. Before we leave the subject, if you didn't have more to say on that, I wanted to get to this New England Journal of Medicine paper.
Absolutely. I want to give a shout out to Ocean. Ocean, who is, I think, always the voice of reason in the comment section of Blogging Heads TV.
Right.
She is very, very smart, and she's a psychiatrist. And I know I've irritated her at some of these broad brush slurs I've made against the psychiatric establishment before. Ocean, I want to get your opinion of this book. Maybe there's this whole literature I'm missing that would cast this in an entirely different light, but I'm really curious to know what you think about this.
Yeah, that'd be great. I am too.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, okay, so this paper, most of what we've been reading, and another thing you referred to in your column was this op-ed piece by Peter Kramer, the guy who wrote Listening to Prozac, which was really a big part of getting people interested in these SSRIs early on. Prozac being the first one that went to market. And he was writing a defense, which you didn't find very persuasive. And his defense was as a backlash to these studies that have come out recently indicating that SSRIs, at least in people who are not, severely, hospital-like depressed, are no better than placebos. So, and that just got, as I hinted or mentioned before, anytime you're talking about epidemiological studies involving drugs, and especially ones involving psychoactive drugs and all of the subtleties and subjectiveness and philosophical conundrums that come from that, like a placebo that makes you feel better, if it's, a placebo that, let's say, made a physical, now we're getting into the philosophical conundrums, the mind-body split. So I don't want to go out on that or down that particular rabbit hole right now. But anyway, this paper, major depressive disorder. Now this, it doesn't look at any of the epidemiological studies, but they went back and did this major review on what actually the laboratory studies are saying. And the SSRIs are based on what they call the serotonin imbalance hypothesis, and they actually use this, and these companies have been criticized for using this with these little cartoons of neurons and neurotransmitters and things, because they're saying science has found that the reason that you're depressed is because you have an imbalance of this chemical called serotonin. And these studies, or that evidence, is basically, based on a lot of circumstantial evidence. One of them is Oh, and then they're saying that our drug will correct this serotonin imbalance, and that's basically based on examining spinal fluid from patients who are being treated, say, with Zoloft or one of the other SSRIs, and seeing if they have more than an average number of the breakdown metabolites, the breakdown products from serotonin, or if they have fewer of them, because then they have presumably more serotonin in their system. So, not so persuasive in and of itself. And just from reading those criticisms, I was just kind of convinced that there's really no convincing evidence whatsoever for the serotonin imbalance theory, and it really turns out not to be the case. And one thing I learned from reading this paper is that serotonin imbalance hypothesis is a subset of a bigger thing called the monoamine deficiency hypothesis, and that serotonin and noradrenaline and dopamine are all part of this monoamine kind of neurotransmitter circuitry in the brain. And while some of the drugs are supposedly specifically targeting serotonin receptors or serotonin reuptake, they're keeping it from being reabsorbed, so you have more of it. Others concentrate on norepinephrine, and some of them concentrate, or is it noradrenaline? I always confuse those. But they have SNRIs, selective noradrenaline, or I should look that up. Anyway, the SNRIs act on two of these monoamines, and then there's other ones that target dopamine. So anyway, this guy is really examining the monoamine deficiency hypothesis as a whole, and I just underlined a few things that really struck me. Like numerous studies of norepinephrine and serotonin metabolites in plasma, urine, and cerebrospinal fluid, as well as postmodern studies of the brains with depressions, have yet to identify purported deficiency reliably. So he's saying that there's no smoking gun yet. But he has these other things that are indirect, but they're pretty persuasive. Like they did a PET scan, a positron emission tomographic study, and they were using a ligand for brain monoamine oxidase, the class of chemicals we're talking about, and it showed that there was a 30% increase of this enzyme in a subgroup of patients with depression. This is an enzyme that breaks down these monoamines that they're targeting with these drugs. So, PET scan showing that this oxidase that breaks down these chemicals that maybe make you feel better when you have the right amount, showing a 30% increase. So that's a little more convincing. Or there are these experiments where you can experimentally deplete serotonin and norepinephrine in humans by giving them oral treatment. So you can give them a drink that contains all the amino acids except tryptophan, and this stimulates the liver to synthesize proteins, and it rapidly depletes the plasma of tryptophan. And tryptophan is rate limiting for serotonin, meaning you need it to produce serotonin. Anyway, so they break down serotonin in patients using this drink, and then they find that the depletion does not induce depression in healthy subjects, but it will cause a relapse of depression in patients who've been successfully treated with serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So that seems like smoking pistol anyway.
Well, the question I would have
concludes
is whether it's sort of the cause and effect problem that you get so often in these kinds of psychiatric studies, whether or not the reaction of for example, the depressed people to this induced deficit of serotonin has more to do with the fact that they've already been treated with drugs, with SSRI.
Well, maybe that changed their brain.
Pardon me?
Maybe that changed their brain.
Because Whitaker,
they're being treated, and then by knocking out. I take your point.
Whitaker has a lot of really fascinating material on how, for example, neuroleptics change the brain. So there is this, the equivalent of the serotonin theory of depression for schizophrenia was the dopamine theory of schizophrenia, that it's an excess of dopamine that creates agitation and disordered thoughts and so forth. And so the neuroleptics block dopamine receptors and calm people down and stop their symptoms. What's happened, there are a bunch of studies that suggest that the dopamine hypothesis is wrong. That's really turned out to be, the evidence just isn't there for it. But there is very suggestive evidence that the neuroleptics cause the brain, when you're suddenly blocking dopamine receptors in the brain starts creating more dopamine receptors. Mm-hmm. So it completely changes.
Right. Oh, sure, you get homeostatic feedback.
Right. And
totally plausible.
And so then you actually are creating some of the brain imbalances that you were supposedly fixing with the drugs in the first place. It's this incredible.
Yeah, you can imagine that happening, but that would happen with any pharmaceutical that's causing, like blood pressure drugs, like change the amount of certain hormones in your bloodstream that cause constriction of your blood vessels, or that control how much the rate of urine that your kidneys release, and the rate that your heart beats. Calcium inhibitors, and you have the body fights back against those, since it wants to be in what it considers its normal resting homeostatic state. So, I mean, if that's why it's so confusing. But I wanted to correct or clarify my earlier confusion. Norepinephrine and noradrenaline are the same thing.
I see.
In SNRI targets.
Hey, George, not to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you're prepared to do this today, but is there a debate in the cancer treatment community, remotely comparable to what's going on in psychiatry about, the term, the wonderful term that we should introduce now is iatrogenic effects. Iatrogenesis is the phenomenon of the treatment being more harmful than the disease, or a treatment that actually hurts the patient. In cancer treatments, is that debate also happening?
Well, I'm not sure there's really a debate, because I think everyone recognizes that every single cancer treatment in use is iatrogenic, in the sense that it causes a huge amount of harm in the patient, like chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. An oncologist is basically an expert in poisoning your body right to the brink and bringing you back, and in the process, hopefully killing these rapidly multiplying cells, since they'll, take up more of these poisons if the drug's designed correctly, and more of them will die than your good cells. And, obviously when you're getting radiation treatment for a tumor, the radiation is killing a lot of healthy tissue, and even a lot of these very targeted therapies that you're reading about with monoclonal antibodies that, zoom right in on certain receptors that are particularly prevalent in certain kinds of cancer cells. Even a lot of those have very sickening side effects, and they're working on ones that will be more like the the old stereotypical or long hoped for magic bullets. But I mean, it's really all basically horrible. But I mean, does the iatrogenic mean harmful to the patient, or does it mean more harmful than the actual condition?
You're weighing the pros and cons. I would think that iatrogenic just means simply that the cons outweigh the pros.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're certainly iatrogenic, but consider the alternative.
Well,
I remember when my wife, who I'm no longer married to, was undergoing, very intense chemotherapy and then radiation for a stage 4 metastatic cancer, and what that does to you. And yet, the more aggressive it is, the more likely it is to get that last little metastasis that can smolder for years and come back. And 7 years later, she's not had any signs of recurrence. But this has actually been on my mind a lot, because my little brother, who lives in Dallas, and I don't think he'd mind me mentioning this just if I keep the generalities, but he's been earlier this year, he was suddenly diagnosed with a squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck, they call it. Mm-hmm. And he had been having problems and feeling pains in his jaw, and, went to dentist and was told it was something dental, or the most recent case, he had this horrible pain while he was driving between Dallas and Albuquerque to see his daughter in college, and sought medical attention and was told that he had somehow dislocated his jaw. And it turns out, finally, someone said, well, maybe we should do a CT scan. And they found that he had a squamous cell carcinoma that was eating into adjacent bone.
Jesus.
And then, they, started coming up with a regimen to treat it. And between the time that they waited, which was, not long, days, it had spread to some of the local. I heard two versions of this. It had spread, let's say, and it's not clear to me whether it had spread lymphatically to what they call signal lymph nodes that are sitting there, ready to try to pick up cancer cells and things, mm-hmm. or whether it spread to other squamous cell tissue. But in any case, he had to go through chemotherapy and radiation, what oncologists call a sandwich, where you do one, then the other, then one, then the other. And it seemed that they'd gotten it all, and he was recovering from this. He still has his disability to enunciate words because of this jaw surgery and because of the radiation mm-hmm. to his throat. And then just a few weeks ago, he went into the hospital because he had symptoms of pneumonia, and it turns out that he has one of these tumors has come back in his throat near his vocal cords.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So now they're going to have to treat that, and we're all very optimistic that they're going to get this. But I was just there last week visiting him, and just the way this. The treatment has walloped him, and it's just this big strapping guy that's just kind of reduced to fatigue and sitting in a chair and getting through the day waiting for a PET scan to make sure it's not getting worse. So or iatrogenic, and yet the alternative is death.
George, are there renegades? But, smart, knowledgeable renegades within oncology who are raising some of the same questions about cancer treatments, about chemo and radiation, that are being raised about, let's say, neuroleptics for schizophrenia, that maybe on balance they're too harmful.
Well, of course, there's this whole debate about breast cancer, and now detection technology has become so precise that you can detect what they call in situ carcinomas in the ducts in the breast. And in situ means that basically you have these cells that are multiplying more rapidly than they normally would, so they've taken some mutational hits. Mm-hmm. But they haven't invaded the surrounding tissue, which is once that happens, that's when you call something malignant. And yet they're considered, it's very possible that this will happen, and yet many of these things grow so slowly that in the past, most women would die who had these before they even knew it, and they would have no effect on their health. Mm-hmm. And of course now people are living longer, so they're finding more for that reason, and they're finding more because detection is more sensitive. And then there's a big debate about how how you treat something like that, whether you should even treat it at all, because, or even whether you should be, we talked about this a long time ago about mammograms, whether, mm-hmm. There was that big study that came out suggesting, raising the age at which they recommended women regularly get mammograms because of the ill consequences of false positives. So, mm-hmm. so in that sense, there are mavericks who will say, maybe you shouldn't treat as aggressively, these relatively unthreatening cancers like that.
Right.
And
then
everyone is working constantly and hoping to come up with monoclonal antibodies and different targeted therapies, and that may have there'll be much fewer side effects anyway than broadband chemotherapeutic poisoning, but they will actually really just seek out the cancer cells and not the healthy cells. But all of this stuff is a huge number of these drugs are in the pipeline, and
right.
And so that's not really a maverick thing. And I don't, as far as maverick people that would say, don't, if you have like a stage 3 or 4 metastatic cancer, that you shouldn't get chemo or radiation. I don't think so.
Yeah. There aren't credible people arguing against that.
Yeah, I mean, what would you do? I mean,
George, I don't know.
Enhance the body's immune system. I guess you could argue that someone might be convinced that they had a way that did that and got the immune system to. But this is it's something that cancer scientists have been working on for decades, and there's always experiments going on. Some of them are promising. They get this last American Association of Cancer Research meeting I went to this spring, there were 16,000 people attending this thing. Jesus. And a good proportion of those people were presenting a paper.
Another issue there is obviously quality of life and sort of weighing the probabilities. If you're told that you go through this course of radiation and chemo, which is going to make you really sick and feel like crap, your chances of living another 6 months are only, 30%.
Oh, well, yeah.
You do that.
That's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
But that applies more to these experimental treatments. Like, there was this amazing series in the New York Times within the last year or less about it was a melanoma drug, and this was one of these these very targeted therapies that's still experimental, and in so many cases like that, it's more these things are incredibly expensive. So it's like $30,000 a month, and maybe adds 3 to 6 months to your life. So, I mean,
yeah,
the reason to encourage people to do that is because it's a way to do clinical trials on these drugs and maybe see what needs to be done to improve them. But as far as adopting a wait and see attitude on a metastatic cancer is just you'll die.
Right. Yeah. Medicine is such a bundle of contradictions, because in some ways it's there is such a thing as miracles of modern medicine. I've experienced them in treatments for my own family when both my children were born by cesarean section, and my wife would have died 100 years ago probably.
Yeah.
My son, I think I might have mentioned when this happened, maybe 2 years ago, he dislocated his elbow in a lacrosse game, which is really a nasty injury. His arm looked, it just really messed up. It was all akimbo. Yeah. It was obvious that something was really wrong. I thought it was broken. I took him to an emergency room. Instantly, the doctor, there's an orthopedic surgeon on duty, and instantly diagnosed it as a dislocated elbow, gave him an anesthetic, put him in this portable x-ray machine, like a real-time x-ray machine, which was really cool, and then just popped it back in, and we were right out of there. And I forget if I've told this story, but I have to tell it again, because it was just such a, wonderful encapsulation of the strength and weakness of medicine. Literally, my son and I were walking out the door of that hospital, and I was really feeling so grateful to the doctors in there for helping him. I got a call on my cell, and it was a friend of mine whose son, I think he was 17 at the time, was in a mental hospital in Brooklyn and had been admitted because he tried to commit suicide. He threatened to jump off a bridge. Mm-hmm. And the doctors wanted to give him shock treatment. And my friend was asking for my advice. I mean, calling up a goddamn science writer to ask for advice on, how his son should be treated for severe mental illness. And
Yeah.
what the hell was I going to say?
Yeah.
But when it comes to those treatments, unfortunately, the doctors, at their best, we need to doubt what they say. Because the treatments are of marginal effectiveness. Shock treatment can bring some suicidal people back from the brink, but long term, its benefits are negligible to none.
Yeah, it's not a subject I know about.
Yeah.
But
anyway.
boy, depression that severe, it's so different from what we usually talk about when we're talking about, depression.
That's right.
I mean, that's, that can get to the point where it's as debilitating as, say, having the death sentence of a metastatic cancer hanging over you, and you can see why a doctor, would, be justified in thinking of any possible treatment. And with your friend's son's case, you'd have to know what other treatments have been tried possibly and failed, and what the prognosis was for non-treatment. Again, if he went home and then succeeded in killing himself, that would obviously be worse than electroconvulsive therapy session.
Yeah, that's right. It's agonizing. I look forward to improvements in this area, but I think we need to be vigilant, and I think at the very least, at the end of Whitaker's book, and actually Marcia Angel has been, who wrote these wonderful articles in the New York Review of Books, and I'll link to them so that people can read them for themselves. She has been a real evangelist for the idea of complete transparency about conflicts of interest in medicine generally and psychiatry in particular.
Yeah. Oh, but that's totally happening.
It is happening.
I mean, I was amazed at this a cancer meeting I went to. Every single talk, it must have been a requirement because it began with a disclaimer.
Yes.
And actually, it was enforced in such a draconian manner that it was clear that a lot of the scientists there were really chafing under this, and not because they had conflicts of interest.
Right.
I mean, some of them would start off and say, I'm a principal in a startup company that's looking into the possibilities, of a drug that would work on this particular genetic pathway, and maybe regulate the protein somehow in this, or gene knockout experiments. So they would give these very brief disclaimers, and some of them it reminded you of those of the disclaimer on the warranties that you get in the Crazy Eddie like ads on TV, where the guy suddenly starts talking at like quadruple speed. Some of them would do that, and it was kind of, I think, to show their contempt for them. And many after the other would just say, I have no conflicts of interest. I remember one person doing this. This guy had been in the field for decades, and people applauded because it was so refreshing. And another case where this guy was giving, I think, one of the presidential symposium addresses, and he said, my only conflict of interest is that I want to see my patients get well.
Nice. That's the guy I would distrust.
Yeah. Okay. No, you wouldn't distrust this guy. He's one of the real important people in the field. But yeah, so you post that, jumping back to depression, and I'll post this this New England Journal of Medicine article because after I read all those links you sent me, and there was an earlier piece we talked about months ago in the New Yorker by Louis Menand, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, that he basically said, referred to the serotonin imbalance hypothesis is almost, he implied it was almost a superstition that nobody outside of the doctor's waiting room actually believed. And I had, started, because it's true, you can't put a helmet on somebody and then measure how their serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine are changing before and after you give them this drug. Mm-hmm. All of the chemical molecular experiments are just much more oblique. But you read this paper and you can see, people aren't just, making this stuff up, and it's not all just wishful thinking. And they also do laboratory experiments with mice where they have they breed mice, what they call models of depression, as an experimental model that are lacking or weak in certain genes that produce certain neurotransmitters, and they treat them with different antidepressants in different maze experiments where you put them in water and see how long they'll struggle to get to the platform before they just decide, oh, the hell with it, I'd rather die. And this sounds silly, but they're plenty of animal experiments have led to great cures for physical ailments. But this stuff is, even though it's controversial, it's a lot more solid than you would think, or at least that I came away with from reading some of these recent articles.
I promise I will check it out. All right, we're at an hour 5.
Oh, we did it. Okay.
So, all right, George, good talking to you again.
Yeah, you too. We'll do it again real soon.
All right, sounds good. Take it easy.